All right, I think we can get started. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for another edition of Science Cafe with the Southeastern Center for Conservation at the Atlanta Botanical Garden. We are very happy to have with us this evening Dr. Ricardo Holdo, who will be presenting on the challenge of being a savanna tree. Just before we get started, I want to let folks know that we are going to be recording this event. So if you have friends or family or anyone who was unable to attend and would like to, we will have that up on our website within probably about a week or less. Also, if you have any questions, we definitely encourage folks to ask questions. And then after the talk, Dr. Holdo can answer some of those questions, but we ask if you could please direct those questions to the Q&A feature. You can see at the bottom of your screen there's a little button that says Q&A, and you can click on that and direct any questions you might have there. Only other thing I'd like to do is just introduce Dr. Holdo and let you all know a little bit about his background. Dr. Holdo was born and raised in Argentina. He obtained his bachelor's degree in biology from Harvard University, his master's in zoology at the University of Florida, and his PhD from Princeton University. After completing postdoctoral work at the University of Florida, he was hired as assistant professor in the Division of Biological Sciences at the University of Missouri and moved to Odum School of Ecology at the University of Georgia in 2016. Dr. Holdo is a broadly trained ecologist and has worked on various aspects of savanna ecology throughout his career, including herbivore behavioral ecology, plant-animal interactions, fire dynamics, tree-grass interactions, climate change, and disease ecology. He has conducted most of his field work and research in East and South Africa, including Zimbabwe, Tanzania, and South Africa. So without further ado, Dr. Holdo, I'll give you the floor.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me share my screen here.
Yeah, it should be set up for you to.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation, for giving me this opportunity to tell you a little bit about the work my colleagues and I have been doing over the last few years in Serengeti. I'm going to tell you a little bit about work we've been doing on the tree community in Serengeti and tree cover dynamics and savannas. And my title slide here kind of motivates this a little bit. I started off my graduate career back in the 90s studying elephant nutritional ecology, and I quickly became fascinated by the other side of the elephant eating equation, the trees, and the abuse that they can take at the hands of mega herbivores and other disturbances in some of these ecosystems where you have things such as elephants and fire and other sort of factors. So so broadly, what I'm going to talk today about is tree communities and savanna ecosystems, and in particular this question of why savannas are the relatively open environments that they are. That, you know, a definition of a savanna that sort of is often used is that they have a continuous layer of grasses and a discontinuous layer of trees. You have an example of that here in Serengeti National Park in Tanzania. It's also important to point out that you know, you have this spatial heterogeneity in savannas with this discontinuous tree cover, but it's important to point out that this is not static. So you can see here the sequence of images taken at the same location, showing some kind of drastic increases in tree cover over time. So it might seem paradoxical that I'm going to talk about how hard it is to be a tree while showing you the trees are increasing here, and that maybe will become a little clearer in a minute. So just to put things into a little bit of context, this is sort of a cartoon I found online that roughly describes the distribution of the tropical savanna biome globally. I think this was actually in a kid's website, but it's actually one of the better maps that I've seen. But you'll notice that a big fraction of the global tropical savanna biome occurs in sub-Saharan Africa, and it's in sub-Saharan Africa that I've done almost all of my field work: Tanzania, Zimbabwe, South Africa. And this is the only continent where we still have mega herbivores that play a really key role in structuring these ecosystems. And so if we want to understand why savannas disappeared in North America, to some degree, it makes sense to study them where they still exist. So if we think of global biomes and vegetation, we can kind of come up with sort of a gradient that goes from open grasslands like these short grass plains in Serengeti through what might look like an iconic Serengeti savanna. You have sort of this grass layer with a few scattered Balanites trees with some grazers in the background. Further north in Serengeti, where it's fairly wet, you have these sort of terminalia savannas. They're still relatively open with shorter statured trees. And then at the extreme of tree cover, if you go to riverine forests, you get closed canopy forests. And it's important to point out that at the extremes, sort of these pure grasslands and these forests, we understand why the vegetation is the way it is. These trees that you're seeing here have access to groundwater. If you go back to the Serengeti plains, what you have is this kind of shallow volcanic soil layer underlain by this hard pan layer called caliche, which is essentially calcium carbonate that's impermeable. And so these soils are not deep enough to hold trees. But in between, you have a wide range of distributions of trees. So this effect of this kind of hard pan layer is shown in this image from southern Serengeti, where you can see that as the topography lifts out of that hard pan layer, suddenly trees start appearing. So there's a very clear effect of soil depth here. If you move to other parts of the ecosystem, you get something sort of in between. So this is an acacia dripanolobium savanna in Serengeti. And the question one might ask is, why do these trees not form a closed canopy? In dry savannas, we know the reason for that is the amount of rainfall and the amount of soil moisture available is insufficient to sustain a closed canopy of trees. But these are relatively wet savannas between 600 and 1,000 millimeters a year, and they do have the potential to allow a closed canopy of trees. So where are those missing trees, and why do we have so much grass? And to be able to understand this question, we need to think about the entire sort of life cycle of the tree and go through various life stages, from seed to seedling, sapling, sort of medium-sized subadult trees and adults. And eventually these adults will produce seeds, and the cycle will repeat itself. And the thing is that there are very strong, let's call them environmental filters, that act at all of these various stages to make it hard for the trees to move from one stage to another, creating a series of bottlenecks. So for example, get my pointer here. At the seed stage, infestation by beetles can lead to seeds not being viable. Germination success can be low as a result of a lack of soil moisture and grass competition, which can make seedling establishment difficult. Once trees become established, they become vulnerable to various types of disturbances such as fire and browsing by small mammals. When they get larger, they can be toppled by elephants and so on. So all of these factors sort of act together to essentially make it very challenging for a tree to move from seed to adult. So just to show you, examples of some of these factors, I mentioned fire in Serengeti. This is not Serengeti, this is Southern Africa, but the effect is largely the same. Fire leads to a lot of sort of top kill, trees are burned above ground, and the larger trees might escape, but the smaller trees will be reset essentially to ground level and have to then resprout. We also have a wide range of herbivores, many of which feed directly in seedlings, like this eland here, or in the sort of inset photo, you can see this giraffe that's very, very interested in a little exclosure that we built to precisely protect seedlings from browsers. So they directly feed on the seedlings. And then you have mega herbivores mega herbivores such as elephants that can consume not only small trees, but very large trees, sometimes with devastating consequences. And then there are herbivores that sort of play indirect roles in these systems, such as the migratory herds of wildebeest and zebra in the Serengeti. They primarily consume grass, but grass interacts with trees, and so you know, these grazing animals can have indirect effects on trees, but they also may have direct effects through trampling, and also because very few of these species are actually pure grazers. So many of them will consume some seedlings as well. And then in some tropical savannas, we also have other effects. For example, this shows an example of a severe frost in Zimbabwe that has killed a lot of these sort of smaller trees while leaving some of the larger trees intact. In temperate ecosystems, trees are adapted to below freezing temperatures. But when you get to the sort of the boundary between subtropical and subtropical savannas, where frost may not be very frequent, a lot of these trees are not adapted, and so periodic frost can lead to sort of really severe dieback in these systems as well. The bottom line is that there are a lot of challenges or constraints that make it difficult for trees to reach adulthood from seed. And so I'll give you some examples of some of these effects. So starting off with these early life stages from seed to sapling, and all of the results I'm going to show you today, or most of them, come from Serengeti National Park in Tanzania. So what you see here is an outline of Serengeti. This is an area where my colleagues and I have been working for quite a while now. For context, this is Lake Victoria. This is the Kenya-Tanzania boundary. So Kenya's up here, Tanzania is down over here, and Ngorongoro Crater is down over here. At the seed stage, seed infestation by bruchid beetles can have huge consequences for seed viability. So these beetles will deposit on the seeds, and then the larvae develop within the seeds and consume a lot of the material that the seed needs to develop. So one of my graduate students, Deus Rugemalila, who's a Tanzanian citizen, did part of his master's work studying this infestation process. And he found that there are extremely high levels of infestation in a lot of these seeds, sometimes up to about 80%. It varies between the two different species I'm showing you here in 2 different years, and it can be quite variable, but it's high. And when infestation occurs, it can have devastating consequences for seed viability. So on the left panel down over here, you can see the viability of uninfested seeds, and this axis goes to about 80%. But on the right-hand side over here, notice the scale difference. It goes up to about 6%. The viability declines precipitously when seeds become infested. What about other factors occurring at this stage? We conducted a sort of a long-term study where we set up a number of plots across Serengeti in collaboration with my colleague Mike Anderson from Wake Forest University, and monitored trees over time and set up some targeted experiments within our plots that allowed us to control some different factors that might be influencing the ability of trees to go from the seed to seedling stage, and then once they became seedlings to establish. So I'll give you an example of one of these experiments. We transplanted small seedlings into small plots and applied different treatments where we either had or withdrew water, grass, or herbivory by putting up cages. And then we can see what effects these different treatments can have on survival. And these are some of the results. You can see here these are some of the seedlings that were grown in a nursery. This is an example of one of those little exclosure plots. This one excludes herbivores and also had grass removed, and you can see the 4 little seedlings in there. And this is what a plot with grass removed but no cage looks like. So this was work that was largely done by a postdoc working with us, Tom Morrison, and you can see here some of the results of this experiment. First of all, what we've seen here is over time, the survivorship of the seedlings that were transplanted under different conditions for 2 different species, Acacia robusta and Acacia tortilis. And two things could really jump out here. One is that when herbivores are removed, survival increases, which is not that surprising, but the effect is relatively small. Much stronger is the effect of removing grass, which may seem somewhat surprising, that this system that's dominated by this herbivore fauna that we know has very strong impacts on trees seems to have a relatively smaller effect than removing grass. And so these grasses, these C4 grasses, are strongly competing with these seedlings and making it really hard for them to survive, grow, and establish. And why is this competitive effect of grasses so strong? There's a number of reasons for this, but grass is essentially, when it comes for the main limiting resource in these systems, which is water, grasses are fundamentally better than trees. They have they can do better under drought stress. So that's what this figure on the far left here shows. It shows the turgor loss point, which basically tells you how low of a water potential they can tolerate in their leaves. And it's lower in grasses than it is in trees. Grasses have a higher water use efficiency, which means that they can translate a gram of water transpired into a gram of carbon more efficiently. They can get more carbon per gram of water transpired, and they have a high intrinsic growth rate. And this is something that is true across a wide range of moisture conditions. So grasses essentially outperform trees, strongly compete with them. I had an undergraduate in my lab once conducting an experiment, growing trees and grasses together under greenhouse conditions and essentially making all these different tree species to compete with the grasses. And the results were quite striking. If we look at the tree competitive response, which basically tells us how much a tree grows with and without grasses, you can see a very strong effect of having grasses present in pots with trees. That's the G+ treatment versus the G- treatment, which is a control without grass. The trees without grass grew to a larger size than trees with grass. But when we look at the effect of the trees on the grasses, a reciprocal effect, there was essentially no effect. A grass growing with no trees developed as much biomass as a grass growing with all of these different tree species. So it's an asymmetric competitive effect. The grasses are dominant, and they have a very strong effect at these early life stages, both on survival and growth for the trees. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the later life stages. What happens when once these sort of seedlings and saplings do establish, having survived some of these sort of filters that are occurring at the early life stages, fire and herbivory become important factors. So to illustrate the effect of fire in the Serengeti ecosystem, I'm going to show you some results of a study that I did as a postdoc a few years ago. That sort of nicely illustrates sort of the long-term effects of fire in the ecosystem. So the starting point for this analysis is a series of photo panoramas collected by my collaborator, Tony Sinclair. This is just one example of them, and I think I showed this one early on. It essentially shows for given locations how tree cover increased over time, and Tony was able to count densities of trees within certain frames of these images and allowed us to come up with rates of change in tree density over time. So each of these dots represents an index of change in tree density for a given location over time. And you can see that if we look at this line here, which represents no change, so that the tree cover would have been static, you can see that there was a period of decline up until about the mid-1970s, followed by a period of increase in tree density. And what we were trying to do was to explain these changes in tree density over time. We had all these other covariates that we could look at as possible drivers of this change. One of them was fire, which changed dramatically over this time period. So this is the proportion of the Serengeti that burned on a given year over time. We can look at changes in elephant population densities. We can look at the populations of wildebeest, which also change. And then we can also incorporate other factors such as various climatic factors related to rainfall, which also experience some changes over this time. So the way we did this is we essentially put all of these variables together into a kind of model called a state space model, and came up with a bunch of sort of hypothetical drivers that could explain ultimately changes in tree patterns over time, and confronted various versions of this model with the data to try to find the model that best explained what we found. So we tested the relative fit of alternative models, and this was the model that was best supported. Essentially, there is a strong link between the wildebeest population, the fire in the system, and changes in the tree cover, with sort of minor effects of seasonal rainfall and dry season rainfall. And this produced very good fits to the data. You can see here that a model, which is represented in red, did a good job of tracking fire over time, and also did a good job of tracking changes in tree cover over time. So the model did pretty well. We're fairly confident in it. But what does this model mean? So this is essentially the best fit. How do wildebeest affect fire? Well, the missing ingredient here is grass, which we didn't actually have data for over time, but very clearly the sort of the mechanism by which the wildebeest are affecting fire is through their effects on grass. So seasonal rainfall affects the intensities of fire. And, you know, when you get a very wet season, you produce a lot of grass, and if it's followed by a very dry season, then that grass is going to be more likely to burn. And then the amount of dry season rainfall affects the population dynamics of wildebeest in the dry season range. But we can put this in an even broader context. The reason the wildebeest population changed so dramatically over this period was because they were released from rinderpest, which is a virus related to measles, which was introduced into the African continent in the late 19th century. It was eradicated from Serengeti sometime in the 60s and 70s, and the wildebeest population exploded after that. And then this had all these cascading consequences. So ultimately, if we look historically at the second half of the 20th century, rinderpest, wildebeest, and fire played the dominant roles in driving tree dynamics. So notice here that there's this important sort of relationship between wildebeest, grass, and fire as factors affecting trees. Previously, I told you that grasses exert a very strong competitive effect on trees, but it's clear that they can also exert a very strong indirect effect via their effects on fire. So grasses then play a dual role. They both compete with trees, but they're also fuel for fires. And grazers such as wildebeest can ameliorate both of these effects. So whereas browsers, animals that directly feed on trees, such as giraffe and elephant, have a negative impact on trees, grazers can actually have positive effects. And that's shown by this study conducted by Jason Donaldson, who at the time he conducted this study was a postdoc with Mike Anderson at Wake Forest University, currently is working in my lab. And Jason conducted an experiment that manipulated a bunch of things simultaneously. Browsers, which are denoted by B in this figure, fire, which is denoted by F, and grazers, which is denoted by G. So we had we were able to sort of tease out the effect of grazers and browsers, which we couldn't manipulate independently with cages, by combining experimental data with some modeling. And this is something that we hadn't been able to do before. Remember in the previous result, I showed you it looked like the caging effect on trees was quite small compared to the grass effect. But if you tease out the caging effect and separate the effects of browsers and grazers, the picture changes a bit. So what we're showing you here is the survival of seedlings that were planted in these plots. And the baseline is this. This N means there's no manipulations. This is the control. This is the baseline survival. So what happens if you add browsers and fire to the system? If you add browsers and fire, survival declines, not surprisingly, and in combination, even more so. But the interesting result here, that's not particularly surprising. Interesting result is that when you add grazers such as wildebeest, survival increases. So these grazers are consuming the grass, they're limiting the competitive effect of the grass, and they're leading to higher survival for the trees. And in particular, it's interesting to see that when you combine the grazers with fire, the grazers essentially eliminate the effect of the fire. And the combination of those two factors jointly is similar to the control case. So there's some sort of interesting kind of direct and indirect effects of grasses here, and some important indirect effect of grazers. So what I just showed you in the previous analysis was examining kind of the historic trajectory of tree cover in the Serengeti. And back in the 70s and 80s, the elephant population had reached really low levels as a result of poaching. But lately, elephant populations have been increasing quite dramatically. And it's a bit of a paradox that overall in sub-Saharan Africa, elephant populations are declining, again, as a result of hunting. But in Serengeti in particular, and some other protected areas, the numbers have been increasing. And these increases are now leading to elephants having a much more dramatic effect on trees than they had historically. So I can show this anecdotally with a sequence from one of our camera traps, where this elephant was essentially caught red-handed, toppling over this large acacia. But more broadly, across all of those plots that I showed you earlier, Tom Morrison analyzed our data and showed that the effect of elephants across the Serengeti ecosystem is quite dramatic. So what I'm showing you here are elephant damage results for 4 dominant acacia species in the Serengeti. And there's 2 things being shown here. One is the bars is the distribution of damage classes, with 0 being no damage and 100 being complete destruction of the tree crown. And you can see that in many cases, the complete destruction category is the dominant one, particularly in this species down here, Acacia senegal, which really suffers a lot of elephant damage. The second thing shown here is the survival probability of the tree for a given level of damage. And you can see that once the level of damage gets really high, the survival probability really plummets. So elephants are having a really strong effect on adult trees in this system. And that's sort of captured by this figure here showing the overall mortality rates of trees over a 5-year period. Acacia senegal, the species that was really taking a beating from elephant that I showed you a minute ago, has suffered mortality rates that are over 70%, compared to baseline mortality rates, which are probably in the order of just a few percent. Much of this is due to elephants. So to just kind of bring you up to date here, now I've introduced all these factors that are kind of interacting and leading to change in these systems. There's all of these things imposing challenges on trees, leading to negative effects: beetles, browsers, fire, grasses through competition, and then some positive effects imposed indirectly by grazers. 2 wrongs don't make a right, but 2 minuses do make a plus. And if we go through this route over here with minus, plus, minus, we end up with a negative positive effect of grazers as well. But overall, we have these various drivers that are having strong negative effects on trees. But these effects are not resulting in sort of equal outcomes for trees across the landscape. I showed you that the ecosystem can be very patchy. And so in addition to these above ground factors that are really kind of affecting trees, there's also a lot going on below ground. And trees and grasses are both strongly dependent on soil moisture as a key limiting resource in these systems. And we've done a lot of work in my lab teasing out how trees and grasses differentially use water, how they compete, and how they partition water. I'm not going to get into that too much today. But what I do want to say is that soil moisture availability and how it affects performance and growth in trees and grasses is strongly dictated by things such as rainfall and soil texture. And these are things that vary across the Serengeti with important implications. So I'm going to give you an example of how soil conditions can interact with some of the previous factors that I just outlined to have kind of really striking effects on the distribution of trees in the system. So this image came up a little soon. What I'm showing you here is kind of a transition from an area that's dominated by grass, let's call it a grassland, and an area dominated by trees, so I'm going to call it a savanna. And one thing I want to point out about this is that This grassland is different from the grasslands I showed you early in the talk, where you have this kind of hard pan layer that's limiting the distribution of trees. Trees do occur in these grasslands at very low densities. And you can see in this figure that the maximum height of these trees is no different from the maximum height in the savanna portion. So the trees that do occur at low densities in these grasslands can actually become tall, mature trees. And the potential for trees to develop in these systems is not different between the two habitats. So in these open grassy habitats and in these savannas, the density of seedlings, or the potential for seedlings to become trees, is not really different. So what's going on in these grasslands? Why are these seedlings not developing into trees? So to kind of investigate this question, we set up an experiment across 8 sites in Serengeti, which I'm showing you here. And across each of these sites, we used a bunch of tools to map tree cover. So the tree cover here is mapped using remote sensing, and you can see very clearly this sort of transition between savanna and grassland. The green patches here represent trees, and there's a lot of them on this side and very few on this side. But in addition, we went out and we tagged juvenile trees or seedlings so that we could follow them over time and understand the demography and understand why it was that they were recruiting in the grassland, in the savanna site, but not in the grassland site. So in addition to tagging all these trees, we also put out a series of environmental sensors and game cameras so that we could monitor the conditions in each of these sites. Are there differences in herbivory, for example, that explain why trees don't recruit in grassland, other differences in fire frequency, and so on and so forth. And so we were able to sort of follow these seedlings over a period of about 3 years. So each of these lines in these diagrams shows the height trajectory of an individual seedling. There's 800 of them total in each of these sites, and the red lines show the average trajectory for a plot. And so one of the things that you can see is that there are lots of points where it looked like a seedling was making progress and was going to recruit into a larger size class and then got cut back. And this perfectly captures this idea that it's challenging to be a tree in the Serengeti. There's a lot of resetting, a lot of slow growth followed by a reversal caused by disturbance. So it's difficult to escape this trap in general. But beyond this, there are some subtle differences across this kind of transition of tree cover from the open sites with grassland to the more closed sites with savanna. Just sort of as a side note, we estimate that if you were to take out disturbance, if you were to take out fire and herbivores, the mean seedling height of the 3 years of study would have been twice what it actually was. So clearly, these factors, such as fire and browsing, are having a really big impact. And we monitored this impact. We put cameras in the grassland sites and the savanna sites, and we counted sort of captures of herbivores, and we monitored fire using remote sensing, and we cataloged events, herbivory and fire disturbance events on all of these seedlings over time. And a key finding is that there actually is no difference in fire frequency, herbivore population density, fire damage or herbivore damage in these sort of two kinds of habitats. In the open grassland sites and the woody savanna sites, there's a lot of variation, but basically there's no difference in fire frequency or fire effects. And if anything, when it comes to herbivores, we actually found more browsers in the savanna side of the equation than in the grassland side. So it's clearly the browsers aren't responsible for the grassland being grassland. If anything, they're being attracted to the place where the trees are present, which is where their food sources are. But herbivores in general, grazers, didn't vary across this landscape. So the things that are killing trees and knocking them back are the same across this boundary. What was different is that the trees tended to grow faster in the savanna sites, the sites with more trees. And so this is the only sort of really key difference, is that the disturbance was the same, but the growth tended to increase and be higher in sites that already had adult trees. And in trying to explain this pattern, it became clear to us that the sort of the dominant and most likely explanation were differences in soil conditions as you move from the open sites to the more closed sites with trees. This is an example of differences in soils between the two sites. We took the soils and we analyzed their hydrological properties. And it turns out that soils from the grassland sites reach the wilting point, which is the point at which trees, plants no longer effectively transpire, at a higher water content than the trees in the savanna sites. Yeah, so there's a lot of unused water in these grassland sites the trees are unable to access. And that's because these grassland sites tend to be clayer, the savanna sites tend to have more sand, and these differences in soil texture and moisture stress could be explaining these differences in growth rate. And so what we did is we took all the data from our study and incorporated it into a simulation model to try to understand what the consequences of these differences in growth rate and these strong disturbance regimes could be for the likelihood that these seedlings would be able to escape into the adult class. And so we resorted to a simulation model to look at this. And the simulation models basically showed us this. The probability of escaping into adulthood for these seedlings increased dramatically as we moved from sites of low growth rate with low tree cover to sites with slightly higher growth rate and higher tree cover. So there's just sort of a subtle increase in growth rate, but that's enough to lead to a high probability of escape for a given disturbance regime. So then in these areas over here that currently have low tree cover, soil conditions are probably such that it's difficult for trees to reach the canopy, whereas in areas that have higher tree cover and more favorable conditions, the trees are more likely to be able to escape into the canopy. So then what is this? Sorry, I'm having trouble reading my own slide here. What this means then is that these soil conditions can sort of really impose constraints on tree growth. And as far as every change over time, some areas are going to change dramatically in terms of tree cover, while others will tend to persist as grasslands. And that can be seen here in one of these photo panoramas. Notice that some areas, like this one over here, when released from fire, increased dramatically in terms of tree cover. But others didn't do as well, right? So there's still sort of large patches of grassland in these areas. And this then might be explained by some of these differences in soil conditions. So these are systems that have very strong disturbance regimes and large populations of herbivores, but they also have subtle and sometimes not so subtle below ground topographical and soil-based differences that can very strongly constrain the ability of trees to grow and escape. So then just to summarize, what we see then is that savanna trees are subject to very strong demographic filters at all stages, from seed all the way to adulthood. And these filters often either outright kill them or set them back and reset them to begin the process all over again. And there are many forces, such as competition from grasses, fire, and browsing, that make it hard for trees to reach the adult stages, while there are others that actually might sort of help them along the way, such as grazing or the eradication of disease. And finally, we often focus on what's above ground, but there can be subtle underlying soil conditions that can constrain tree growth and can interact with disturbance and herbivores to create quite striking mosaics of woodland and grassland across the landscape. So I'll stop there and I'll put up my acknowledgement slide. This work is collaborative work, and there are collaborators, postdocs and grad students who've worked on this over the years. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Holdo. That was a very interesting topic.
Thank you.
Incredibly complex. a lot of factors that play into that. If folks have any questions they'd like to ask, feel free to direct those to the Q&A. It usually takes a minute or two for folks to type in questions, but I actually have one thing I was thinking about. I was wondering if you looked into the frequency of anthropogenic fire regimes in that area in the past 100 years and how that's possibly changed.
Right. So, I mean, a lot of the fire in the system is anthropogenic in origin. So the key thing is that at large scales, so fires can be, they can be ignition limited or they can be fuel limited. So at large scales, at the whole Serengeti level, fires are essentially fuel limited. Mm-hmm. So, and this is quite clear when you look at the sort of the western boundary of the park. You can see lots and lots of ignition events, but historically, when the wildebeest population was low, those fires then propagated into the park and burnt large areas of the park. But then when the wildebeest population exploded and a lot of the grass biomass was reduced, those fires couldn't penetrate as much. So I'd say most fires are anthropogenic, but how much of the Serengeti burns is less a function of human action just because fuel plays such a big role. Now that's historically. Now things are changing a little bit because in the past there was quite a laissez-faire attitude by park management towards fires, and now park rangers drive around the park and systematically light early season fires. So now that sort of coupling of fires to wildebeest may have been broken a little bit because the fires are much more under human control than under fuel control.
All right. See a question that popped up there. This is from Noah Berg, and they ask, can you speak about the composition of trees in the area where their growth is favored? It seems that acacia tree dominates. Is there variety, and have you explored what some of the drivers of tree composition are?
Yeah, so there's less variety than you see in other savannas. So another system where I work is Kruger National Park. There's a much larger diversity of tree species there. The Serengeti is dominated almost completely by what we call acacias, which are now no longer acacias per se. They are in the genus Senegalia and Bachelia. But yeah, acacias make up the bulk of the trees over much of Serengeti. There is an area of sort of northern Serengeti with sandier soils that has more terminalias and combretums, but those are areas that we comprise a relatively small part of the Serengeti that we haven't really worked in. But overall, conifera and acacias dominate. There is variation in composition, and you know, one of the species that I showed earlier, Acacia drepanlobium, which is an antacacia, tends to occur in soils with a very high clay fraction. There are two dominant species that we worked a lot with, Acacia tortilis and Acacia robusta. Acacia robusta tends to favor somewhat wetter areas, and Acacia tortilis somewhat dry areas. So there are, if you break it down by species, there are some, compositional species level associations with environmental factors. But broadly speaking, some of the patterns that I've shown you, I think, hold across species. So for example, the growth patterns across the sort of the boundary from the very open to the less open sites are supported at the individual species level as well as at the community level.
All right. Thanks for that question, Noah. If anyone else has any questions, feel free to shoot them just in the Q&A there. In the meantime, though, I was wondering, is there any particular area of Africa that if I were to visit Africa, to visit some of these savannas, is there one that really sticks out to you as like, this is an excellent example of an African savanna?
Yeah, so I think Serengeti sometimes gives a little bit of a distorted view because it's a very open savanna. Um, Most savanna sites have much more woody cover. So the other site that I work in Kruger National Park, where I did my graduate work in Zimbabwe in the Kalahari Sand woodlands, they're sort of much more at the woody extreme of savannas. You can still call them savannas, but they're much woodier. So it depends what you want to do. If you're interested in the botanical side of things, I would say that the Southern African savannas are more interesting. But you're interested in seeing large herds of animals, then going to Masai Mara and Serengeti are sort of probably better options. Yeah,
All right, I'm writing that down. Thank you.
sure.
All right, so yeah, no more questions at the moment. If folks do have more questions though, feel free to email those to me and I can go ahead and forward those over to Dr. Holdo. I'd just like to share, oh, one popped up. Let's see.
Yes, the answer is yes. Sorry,
Yes.
I made a mental note to explain that and I forgot. Browsers eat seedlings, trees, grazers eat grass. We've always classified animals quite neatly into grazers, browsers, and mixed feeders. And recent work based on DNA analysis, DNA metabarcoding of dung is showing us that things aren't as clear as we thought. But yes, that is the definition of browsers and grazers.
Okay. We've got a question also in the chat. I see it says, this is an excellent presentation. Makes me ask, do any questions in ecology have a simple answer?
No.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
I mean, questions that we think are long settled keep popping up. But I guess we're slowly kind of making our way. I mean, if we reduce things to really kind of simple cases and bring the field into the lab, we can find clean answers. But when we're in the field, there are just so many variables that we just have to keep chipping away at things. I mean, I think we do have some clear answers, but it's tough.
All right. Well, I've got a last slide to put up on the screen there that I will share. I just wanted to share with you all, Dr. Holdo does have a lab website, and that is holdo.ecology.uga.edu. And again, we will have a recording of this, should be up on the website by the end of the week, hopefully. And you can get that at atlantabg.org/conservation-research/outreach-education-and-training/science-cafe. Or another thing you can do is just type in your Google search Atlanta Science Cafe, and that'll be the first thing that pops up in your search list. Again, if anybody has any questions or suggestions about how we can improve Science Cafe or any thoughts on topics that they would like to hear about, feel free to shoot me an email at isabo@atlantabg.org. And also check out our website at atlantabg.org/conservation-research. And for folks that are Instagram users, you can also check out our Instagram at atlantabgconservation. Again, Dr. Holdo, I really appreciate you coming out with us tonight, or being here with us tonight. And yeah, it was a great presentation. And thanks everyone who attended tonight. And actually, I see more questions. Do you mind? Is it okay if we answer those?
Yes, it's fine.
Yeah. So
yeah.
Let's see.
So where did I go? Well, I went to school. I grew up in Argentina. I went to school and started university before moving to the US to study from undergraduate to graduate degrees. And what got me into biology is a good question, because I actually started in physics and was planning to major in physics and then switch to biology because I decided I didn't want to be stuck inside a lab doing science. So biology provides an opportunity to combine science lab with field work, and that's why I got into biology. Plus, I love the outdoors, so.
Me too. Well, thank you for that question, Irene. And yeah, again, thank you so much, Dr. Holdo, and thanks for everyone who came out tonight.
Thanks
Everybody
very much.
have a great evening.
All right, thank you. Bye-bye.